Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to objectively break down an absolutely unprecedented shift happening right now at the very highest levels of India's space program. For decades, working at the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO, was built on this foundation of almost monastic dedication. You had brilliant scientists trading lucrative corporate careers for the sheer patriotic thrill of placing India among the stars. But recently? Well, a massive tremor has shaken that foundation. We're looking at a critical pivot point in how space exploration is fueled, and it all comes down to the talent behind the rockets. Let's dive in.
Okay, so here's the massive disruption we're talking about. Over 100 of ISRO's most experienced minds have suddenly submitted resignations or requests for early retirement over just the last few months. And to be clear, we are not talking about entry-level turnover here. We are talking about the veteran engineers, the senior simulation experts, literally the people who physically made India's historic space milestones possible. It's this quiet exodus that has actually forced the government to step in and build an administrative firewall.
To really understand this high-stakes turning point, here is our agenda. We're going to explore the internal push factors driving the exodus, the booming private sector pull that's attracting this talent, the flagship missions suddenly at risk, and finally, the government's unprecedented response to stop the bleeding.
Let's move right into Section 1, the ISRO talent exodus, and see how this all builds on a staffing crisis that's been quietly growing for years. So what's really fascinating here is that even before this recent wave of resignations hit, ISRO's staffing gap had already hit a 25-year high. They dropped to just 72.2% capacity. To put that into perspective, against the sanctioned strength of over 20,000 posts, the Department of Space currently has only around 14,600 employees. That means nearly 3 out of every 10 desks are just sitting empty. The agency attributes this massive accumulation of vacancies to cascading effects since 2020. Things like COVID-19 restrictions, sweeping sectoral reforms, and super stringent recruitment procedures that literally caused a 2 to 3 year gap in hiring.
But what makes the recent 100-plus resignations so alarming isn't just the raw number. It's exactly where these people are leaving from. These departures are incredibly concentrated at the very peak of ISRO's technical hierarchy. We're talking about roughly 80 people quitting the U.R. Rao Satellite Center, which is the absolute nucleus of India's satellite development. On top of that, at least another 20 have left the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center, ISRO's largest hub for launch vehicle technology. These are incredibly strategic centers.
Bringing us to Section 2. Why are scientists leaving? Let's take a look at the internal push factors causing this.
You might be wondering, why walk away from such prestigious national work? Well, it boils down to an intense, growing tension between the rigid, historical prestige of government work and the lucrative, super agile, modern private aerospace sector. ISRO scientists are classified as civil servants. That means their salaries are strictly bound by fixed government pay scales. But beyond the money, veterans constantly point to the stifling weight of public sector bureaucracy. We're talking slow administrative approvals, hierarchical promotion structures, and just endless administrative paperwork. For a scientist driven by cutting-edge innovation, a slow-moving environment like that can absolutely sap their motivation.
And we can see these exact frustrations echoed by insiders online. In a completely unfiltered Reddit thread, verified aerospace engineers impartially noted that public sector constraints simply can't compete with private market compensation. One user pointed out that a similar role at a company like SpaceX could offer a massive salary ratio of 1 to 15 compared to ISRO. 1 to 15. They also highlighted the immense amount of rubbish paperwork bogging down their daily routines. When highly trained engineers feel like they are pushing paper instead of pushing boundaries, you can see why the frustration naturally builds.
Moving on to Section 3, the private space boom. Because, as you'll see, the internal friction is really only half the story.
There is a massive external magnet drawing this talent away, and it's India's rapidly expanding private space ecosystem. Thanks to the landmark space sector reforms of 2020 and the Indian space policy in 2023, the private aerospace industry has absolutely exploded. India now boasts over 400 registered space startups armed with hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital. We're talking about highly dynamic companies like Skyroot Aerospace, Agnicol Cosmos, and Pixel. And they aren't just component suppliers anymore. They are building their own launch vehicles and deploying advanced satellite constellations.
To succeed, these 400-plus startups desperately need experienced hands who actually understand the practical realities of spaceflight. And they are fiercely competing for this talent, pulling veterans directly out of ISRO. So what are they offering? 2 to 3 times the government's salary, lucrative equity and stock options, flat organizational structures where decisions are made quickly, and the ultimate creative freedom to build brand new technologies right from scratch. Essentially, The very ecosystem that ISRO helped nurture has become its absolute fiercest competitor.
Okay, let's jump into Section 4, Impact on Flagship Missions. Why does this matter so much right now?
Well, it matters because there are massive national projects literally hanging in the balance. These are not just everyday robotic launches. We are talking about zero-failure missions. At the very top of that list is Gaganyaan, India's first crewed human spaceflight mission, where every single subsystem must meet incredibly stringent safety standards. Then you've got Chandrayaan-4 for a complex lunar sample return, SpotX for precision space docking, and Mangalyaan-2 heading back to Mars. Human spaceflight and planetary exploration require absolute continuity of expertise. So a sudden loss of specialized talent introduces some really severe vulnerabilities to these historic timelines.
And just look at the caliber of talent walking out the door. We aren't losing junior staff here. The project director for the LVM-3 heavy lift rocket, Victor Joseph, resigned. The project director for SpotX quit. And incredibly, Aditya Ralapelli, the mission project manager for simulations on Chandrayaan-3, also left. He led the dedicated group that generated nearly 25 terabytes of data from over 100,000 tests. That is the exact data that physically ensured India's historic moon landing sequence. Replacing 20 years of institutional knowledge like that is virtually impossible in the short term.
So, let's look at Section 5, the government's countermove. How do you protect flagship missions from a sudden brain drain? You have to take drastic administrative action. To stem the tide, the Department of Space essentially built a massive administrative firewall. It's a bit of regulatory whiplash, honestly. Back in November 2020, a policy decentralized power, making it super easy for local ISRO center directors to just approve voluntary retirements and resignations on their own. But as the private sector boomed post-2023, the talent drain really accelerated. So on July 14, 2026, the government issued a strict memorandum, completely revoking that 2020 policy for any scientists attached to critical national missions.
This new administrative bottleneck is incredibly tight. The government has effectively frozen those easy exits for key personnel. Center directors have been directly advised not to accept resignation requests as a matter of routine until these prestigious projects are actually completed. Instead, if someone wants to leave, every single exit request must be routed all the way up to the Department of Space in New Delhi for a final centralized decision. It is a highly calculated move to ensure mission continuity.
Now, the leadership at ISRO is remaining very pragmatic about this whole situation. Chairman V. Narayanan publicly acknowledged the attrition, viewing it as a totally normal part of an evolving, healthy ecosystem. He emphasized that this new memo is simply a protective measure to ensure that vital national projects don't suffer sudden disruptions. The message here is clear. They aren't villainizing the private sector, and they aren't villainizing the scientists leaving. They are just restructuring to make sure the nation's most ambitious goals are safely delivered on time.
Ultimately, this exodus really just reflects the massive success and growth of India's entire space ecosystem. It's transitioning from a strict government monopoly to a thriving public-private powerhouse. But as India's space ambitions soar toward huge new horizons, like the Bardia Antarctic Station, we want to leave you to ponder this. How must legacy institutions like ISRO fundamentally adapt their culture, their flexibility, and their compensation to truly thrive alongside a booming private sector? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.